There are many types of research methods. Different methods are used and selected depending on what type of research we are preparing. Research methods used in science are built on the foundations of the scientific method. The scientific method is the primary tool that all researchers should use when delving into a specific topic. Although the use of these methods does not eliminate the influence of the researcher and their emotional attitude on the course and results of research work, it strongly reduces it. In practice, it is difficult or even impossible to guarantee the reliability of the research. This is because even subconsciously the researcher can be biased. Consistently applying the procedure of the method, it is easier for the researcher to limit the errors resulting from their own sympathies and/or prejudice. All research methods are based on the scientific method. The scientific method consists of 4 key components. Each of them is equally important, and together, according to the established sequence, they constitute a coherent process. This process begins with the tasks of observation and describing the phenomenon as accurately as possible. The next stage stems directly from the first, because based on the observations made, the researcher begins to construct questions about why the observed phenomena occur. Let's say that the researcher observes the level of air pollution. They make the observation, obviously using some kind of measuring instrument. They describe as precisely as possible the circumstances, the environment, etc. Always, the more, the better. Even seemingly insignificant observations can prove crucial to the research. Then, the researcher makes a research hypothesis or try to extrapolate subsequent states, phenomena, or results. Going back to the example with air pollution. The researcher, based on observation, notices a certain regularity. The level of pollution varies depending on the ambient temperature. In view of this, they put forward the thesis that a decrease in ambient temperature causes an increase in air pollution. That is, they predict that if the temperature decreases, the level of pollution will increase, and vice versa. Once a thesis has been established, the researcher proceeds to the next step. They plan and conduct experiments to prove or disprove the thesis they have defined. Quantitative research methods are, of course, often different, but they are also constructed in accordance with the scientific method. Quantitative methods involve conducting experiments to test a specific hypothesis. That is, the researcher will test whether in fact ambient temperature and pollution levels are significantly related. The example gives 2 parameters, but of course the hypothesis could just as well include more. These parameters are always defined by the researcher as an independent variable or a dependent variable. In our example, temperature is the independent variable and pollution level is the dependent variable. This follows directly from the research hypothesis, which assumes that temperature causes a particular effect and not the other way around. Of course, the hypothesis needs not to be true. This is what research is all about. Experiments test the relationships between these variables to determine what causes a phenomenon. Qualitative methods are quite different in nature. They do not refer to the study of relationships between some parameters. Qualitative methods are used for studying very specific cases about which little is known because, for example, it is difficult to measure or define something quantitatively. Often it concerns subjective information. Examples of qualitative methods are participant observations, surveys, interviews, or case studies. We are not able to use measurable parameters every time, and we are left only with evaluation. Art is an excellent example. It is difficult to measure why some paintings are more popular than others and what prices they reach on auctions. It can only be a subject of qualitative evaluation. Something is better, something is worse. You can't even really say why, just because. Even the motives of the evaluations can be completely unclear, surprising, different. In vast majority, a single research method is used. But the next research method discussed is founded in the ability to combine methods. An excellent example of combining research methods is the recording of measurable biomedical parameters of people undergoing an event as a part of quantitative method, combined with a qualitative satisfaction survey using questionnaires. This type of research, if properly prepared, makes it possible to take advantage of the strengths of the methods used so that the results are more complete, providing greater cognitive potential. Of course, it is not without its drawbacks. Such an approach is usually more cumbersome, more expensive, and more difficult to interpret. The scientific method is the system used by scientists to examine data, generate and test hypotheses, develop new theories, and confirm or reject previous results. Although the exact methods used in different sciences differ, for example, physicists and psychologists work in very different ways, they share some fundamental attributes that can be called the characteristics of the scientific method. The 5 key descriptors of the scientific method are empirical, replicable, provisional, objective, and systematic. Empirical observation. The scientific method is empirical. This means that it is based on direct observation of the world and rejects hypotheses that contradict observable facts. This contrasts with methods that rely on pure reason, including the method proposed by Plato, and methods that rely on emotional or other subjective factors. Repeatable experiments. Scientific experiments are repeatable. This means that if another person duplicates the experiment, they will get the same results. Scientists should publish enough information about their method that another person, properly trained, can replicate the results. This contrasts with methods that rely on experiments unique to a particular person or small group of people. Provisional results. The results produced by the scientific method are provisional. They are, or should be, open to question and discussion. If new data emerge that contradicts a theory, that theory must be modified. For example, the phlogiston-based theory of fire and combustion was rejected when evidence against it emerged. Objective approach. The scientific method is objective. It is based on facts and the world as it is, not on beliefs, wishes, or desires. Scientists try, with varying success, to get rid of the biases when making observations. Systematic observation. Strictly speaking, the scientific method is systematic. That is, it relies on carefully planned studies rather than random or chance observations. Nevertheless, science can begin with a casual observation. Isaac Asimov said that the most exciting sentence to hear in science is not "Eureka," but that's funny. After a scientist notices something curious, they proceed to systematically study the phenomenon. Why should you only test one variable at a time in an experiment? Descriptive and causal research answer fundamentally different types of questions. Descriptive research is designed primarily to describe what happens or what exists. Causal research, which is also known as experimental research, is designed to determine whether one or more variables cause or affect the value of other variables. Directionality of hypothesis. A causal research hypothesis is directional. It does not simply claim that two or more variables are related, but predicts that one variable or set of variables, called independent variables, will affect another variable or set of variables called dependent variables in a certain way. An example of directional hypothesis might be: I predict that the increased weight of a car will lead to a decrease in its acceleration capability. A non-directional hypothesis, which would be appropriate for a descriptive study, would simply predict that there is some relationship between the variables weight and acceleration. Variable manipulation and controls. In causal studies, researchers manipulate a set of independent variables to determine their effect on the dependent variables, if any. Researchers in causal studies also use a control, a case in which the independent variables will not be manipulated, to allow researchers to compare the effects of manipulating the independent variables with the effects of leaving them unchanged. A descriptive study usually does not include variable manipulation or controls. Data collection methods. Descriptive studies. Descriptive research uses two basic types of data collection: cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies. Cross-sectional studies attempt to represent data at some point in time. Variables in cross-sectional studies are measured only once. A longitudinal study, on the other hand, involves a fixed, relatively stable sample measured repeatedly over time. In both cases, the methods used may include surveys or interviews by mail, online, or in person. Data collection methods. Causal studies. Case studies use two basic types of data collection: laboratory experiments and field experiments. Laboratory experiments are conducted in artificial environments that allow researchers to precisely control the variables being manipulated, while holding other factors constant. Field experiments are conducted in the field, in a natural or realistic environment. Field experiments allow researchers to test how their hypotheses relate to the real world. However, in field experiments, it is often impossible to control for all possible variables, making it difficult for researchers to say with certainty what exactly caused an effect. Eliminating bias in a research project can be difficult. Qualitative research is a type of scientific investigation that aims to provide answers to a question without bias. They use predetermined structures, such as interviewing participants, to gather information and present rules. Biases occur naturally during research design, but you can minimize their impact by recognizing and dealing with them. An unbiased qualitative research design respects the dignity of research participants, adheres to basic ethics, and takes all variables into account. Avoid design problems by understanding the limitations of the study group. For example, if you are studying the health benefits of a certain food, remember that only women or people over a certain age can participate in the study. Bias can occur if certain groups are left out. Take into account an unavoidable omissions by changing the design of the experiment. Make sure that research participants are independent and treated with respect, which protects them from being exploited. This will ensure that people are not chosen because of a desire to prove a particular research objective. Avoid focusing on one point of view when observing participants, as this compromises the impartiality of the research. Allow sufficient time for study participants to complete questionnaires. Procedural bias can occur if you put too much pressure on them. For example, employees who are asked to complete a survey at the end of their work when they want to go home are more likely to skip questions without reading them thoroughly. Be aware of errors in data collection and measurement processes. For example, when collecting information about prejudice against people of other races, know that most people are reluctant to answer in an interview because they fear being judged and appearing racist. Researchers often deal with measurement bias by using multiple interviews and anonymous questionnaires. They realize that people will tell the interviewer what they think the interviewer wants to hear instead of the truth. This is a very important aspect of research planning. Review all variables resulting from the experiment to ensure that there are no experimental errors. False positives and negatives will certainly generate inaccurate results. Show that as a researcher you understand that certain biases exist and that you have made every effort to account for them in your analysis and statistics. Make sure that the results of how the data results are analyzed and presented are discussed in the literature. This will also avoid bias in reporting your findings. The terms proposition and hypothesis both refer to the formulation of a possible answer to a specific scientific question. Specifically, a proposition refers to the relationship between two existing concepts. The main difference between the two is that a hypothesis must be testable and measurable, whereas a proposition deals with pure concepts for which no laboratory tests are currently available. Hypothesis and the scientific method. Formulating a hypothesis is the first step in developing a theory according to the scientific method. It is a reasonable assumption based on research and practical knowledge. For a hypothesis to be considered correct, it must make predictions that scientists can test through repeated experimentation. If a hypothesis cannot be falsified by experiment, it cannot be considered part of a valid scientific theory. Scientific propositions. The proposition is similar to a hypothesis, but its main purpose is to suggest a relationship between two concepts when that relationship cannot be verified experimentally. As a result, it relies heavily on previous research, reasonable assumptions, and existing correlational evidence. A researcher may use a proposition to stimulate further research into a question, or to pose it in the hope that further evidence or experimental methods will be discovered to make it a testable hypothesis. Valid uses for propositions. Propositions can play an important role in the scientific process. By suggesting a relationship between two concepts, a scientific proposition can suggest promising areas of inquiry to researchers. In areas of science where a correct hypothesis is rarely possible, a proposition can serve as a common assumption that can support further speculation. This may be the case for extremely complex systems, such as those dealt with in sociology and economics, where it would be too expensive or difficult to conduct an experimental tests. Propositions are also valuable in areas of science where little hard evidence remains, such as archaeological or astronomical studies, where only fragments of evidence have been discovered. Drawbacks of propositions. Because a proposition is not based on testable data, it is more difficult to refute it in a scientific context. It only needs to be convincing and internally consistent to appear valid. Propositions that meet both conditions, however, turn out to be wrong or inaccurate when new, testable data becomes available. Belief in theses that have been widely accepted for a long time can be extremely difficult to overcome, even when other researchers make more plausible propositions. The most important value of the research conducted is the data obtained and the conclusions developed. Data is indiscriminately collected material from the experiment conducted. Data obtained in this way can be, of course, subjected to various operations that promote its readability, such as sorting, grouping, filtering, etc. They are often presented using various visualizations. The presentation of data is not their interpretation. On the other hand, conclusions developed based on the analysis of the collected experimental data are already treated as their interpretation. Basically, by reviewing the collected data, you decide whether the results are consistent with your hypothesis or contradict it. To better illustrate the essence of these differences, let's use an example. A researcher conducts a study of water temperature in an attractive tourist location. On this basis, they have data in the form of values of water temperatures depending on the time, moment of the measurement. On the other hand, if the researcher, based on many years of data, comes to the conclusion that it is profitable to commercially operate this facility during the months of May to September, then this is a formulated, clear conclusion of the research. Science has long been divided into two schools describing its different functions: descriptive and normative. In any scientific investigation, a scientist can be said to take either a descriptive approach or a normative approach. There are fields of science that are either descriptive fields or normative fields. Generally, descriptive science takes an experimental approach and seeks to establish clear and observable facts, while normative science seeks to explain and refine something. Fields like physics or biology are usually classified as descriptive, and fields like ethics are classified as normative. But don't take it for granted. It is important to understand the difference and apply the appropriate approach. Descriptive sciences. Descriptive sciences aim to describe, measure, understand, and record the actual measurable reality around us. They are those sciences that have an experimental approach to their methodology, such as chemistry or physics. They create observable and immutable facts and measurements, such as the apple falls to the ground. The goal of descriptive science is to discover what the world is like, or what things really are, which means what we actually know through verifiable measurements. Experimental verifiability is key. Descriptive inquiry. Descriptive research methodology uses experimentation and measurement. Descriptive science seeks to establish verifiable facts by demonstrating consistent results through repeated experiments. In the case of ethics or philosophy, it seeks to establish facts about how people behave or think by measuring observable quantities, such as using statistics to find out how many people suffer from a certain mental condition or hold certain moral values. Normative science. Normative sciences develop and seek to discover how things should be. In areas such as ethics, they will ask questions such as, is it okay to terminate a pregnancy? While descriptive sciences will only seek to discover facts such as, what percentage of people think it is okay to punish termination of pregnancy? Normative sciences seek to discover good ways of doing things, or the right way of thinking. The three recognized normative sciences are aesthetics, ethics, and philosophy. Normative inquiry. In order to make decisions or statements about whether something is good or right, normative sciences must operate within a set of norms or dominant beliefs. They need to know how people already think and behave, what their beliefs and thoughts are, to establish norms within which they can make what are essentially value judgments. Normative science inquires into how things are and then tries to improve them.